benedicta
Hello, and welcome to Historia Ecclesiastica. My name is Daniel Sudi, and in this The Enlightenment and the World Wars video, we will be examining how atheism caused World War I, or we could say how the Enlightenment caused World War I, or even how liberalism caused World War I, because as we will see in just a moment, all three of these different schools of thought are intrinsically connected, if not synonyms for one another. Let's pray a prayer for world peace that we read from St. John Paul II as we talk about one of the greatest periods of darkness and warfare in world history. Let's pray that our world can be preserved from such a dark fate in the future. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, amen. Lord Jesus Christ, who are called the Prince of Peace, who are yourself our peace and reconciliation, who so often said, "Peace to you, please grant us peace." Make all men and women witnesses of truth, justice, and brotherly love. Banish from their hearts whatever might endanger peace. Enlighten our rulers that they may guarantee and defend the great gift of peace. May all peoples on the earth become as brothers and sisters, and may longed-for peace blossom forth and reign always over us. Amen. We pray this through Christ our Lord. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Please like, share, and subscribe, at least one of those. And also, you'll see that this video covers a huge topic, and it's a huge historical argument, so I'm sure you may have disagreements or additional information that you don't see here. Please comment either one of those things as you watch. And let me explain a little bit about the thumbnail, how I said liberalism and the Enlightenment and atheism are all synonyms, or at least intrinsically connected. Some might say that liberalism, when referring to 19th century liberalism, some might define it very narrowly as merely the belief in a liberal government, one that has democracy and human rights. However, in general, liberalism, even in the 19th century, could be understood as a, quote, liberal or free, end quote, relationship with traditional theology or philosophy or beliefs. So even today, when we say that idea is very liberal or that school of thought is very liberal, they did use the word liberal like that back in the 19th century as well. In practice, liberal thought is pragmatically atheistic, even if purported deists or even Christians are expressing liberal thought. By definition, liberal thought ignores divine revelation in pursuing truth and attempts to use merely secular or even kind of materialistic means to arrive at academic truth. So in practice, liberalism is atheistic. And it was the Enlightenment which gave the world this system of atheistic liberal thought. So that's why we can say that it was the Enlightenment, it was liberalism, and it was atheism, at least on the practical level, which is going to lead to World War I. And I think that in this video, you'll see some very strong arguments to demonstrate that it was, in fact, the system of thought the Enlightenment gave the world, which gives us World War I just over a century later. And referring to liberalism as a theological system, as you may have heard Pope Pius IX once said, I have always condemned liberal Catholicism, and I will condemn it again 40 times over if it be necessary. Okay, so in this video here, what argument am I going to be making? I am going to be arguing that the Enlightenment created a Western world in which a variety of conditions merged into the devastating effect of World War I. So the Enlightenment in general shaped the Western world of the 19th and 20th centuries, especially the early 20th centuries. And the world which the Enlightenment created sent the Western society, sent the many nations of Western society on a sort of collision course towards World War I. I'm not saying that it was inevitable. I'm not saying that the Enlightenment inevitably caused World War I, but the societal institutions which the Enlightenment gave the Western world are the cause of World War I. And I think in this video you'll see that those societal institutions can be clearly connected back to the Enlightenment, and they can clearly be seen as direct causes of the devastation we see between 1914 and 1918. So what did the Enlightenment give the world that caused World War I? The scientific and technological revolutions, the first and second industrial revolutions of the 19th century, hyper-nationalism as a sort of idolatry, the new imperialism, the primacy of subjectivity over the objective reality. So people begin to emphasize more their subjective experience over objective reality. And finally, a rejection of Christianity as the conscience of society. Those are the 6 factors that the Enlightenment put into the DNA of Western society that would end up causing World War I. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about all 6 of those before we take a deep dive into each one of them. So this is an expanded argument I'll be making here. Once again, the Enlightenment gave the world the following causes of World War I. Let's talk about the first cause, the scientific and the technological revolutions. I'm going to argue here that the creation of numerous new technologies, which wouldn't have been possible without the scientific revolution, which preceded the technological revolution, gave Western nations military and economic advantages without the moral regulation of the church. And those technologies would be used for mass destruction. The first and second industrial revolutions. These industrial revolutions were caused both by the development of new technologies and machinery and Smith's wealth of nations theories. We're going to look into both of those. Hypernationalism. The Enlightenment states, the secular states of the 19th century, came to define their purposes as to promote the idolatrous glory of the nationality, because these nations had lost a sense of their ultimate purpose as being a nation which was oriented towards the service of God. Without the motivation of the nation to orient all of its institutions towards the glory of God under the direction of the church, the nation itself became the ultimate end which the state was supposed to serve, turning the nation into a sort of God which should be served by all means. Now, evolving out of both the Industrial Revolution and hypernationalism, we'll see that these European countries are going to spread all over the world in order to establish new markets for their manufactured products, but also just to express the glory and the dominance of their nations. So it was this idolatrous nationalism. And we'll see that not all nationalism is idolatrous, but the 19th century had issues with nationalism being idolatrous. It was this idolatrous nationalism and the need to extend their markets, which led the European countries to spread out all over the world. The primacy of the subjective over the objective. So the Enlightenment itself is based upon the famous Cartesian theory that I think, therefore I am, or the famous Cartesian axiom. Therefore, all Enlightenment thought derives ultimate truth, something we can be absolutely certain is true, upon human thought. So the subjective thought of the individual becomes the surest thing in the society that was formed from Enlightenment thought. This gives more emphasis on the subjective experience, thoughts, and feelings of individuals than is necessary. And it starts to de-emphasize objective reality in favor of subjective experience. Finally, we'll see that all of these developments, which we just talked about, could have been reordered back to God if Western society still recognized Christianity and the church as the soul and the conscience of society. But because the Enlightenment encouraged all people of the West to stop looking to the church as the moral authority of civilization, each of these institutions we just talked about are going to go off in a very dark and dangerous direction, because they lacked the moral direction of the church. All right. In other words, let's sum it all up again. World War I was a godless war, and it occurred only after a godless intellectual movement spread its tentacles all over Western society. So let's start off talking about the scientific and the technological revolutions, what they were, how they were caused by the Enlightenment, and how they led to the destruction of World War I. And we'll also talk about how these revolutions would have been different if the West had remained a Christian society. So what is the scientific revolution? Picking up on the mathematical precision of the scholastic philosophers and the critical studies of the Renaissance movement, Francis Bacon, who lived from 1561 to 1626, founded the modern scientific method. At the same time, Descartes, who lived from 1596 to 1650 and was French, could be held responsible for introducing the seed of doubt into metaphysical presuppositions, which the Western world once held as foundational. So he began to lay the seed of doubt, saying, how can we really know that this particular teaching of divine revelation, like the fact that there is a God, or that God created the universe in the manner that he did, or that the scriptures are true, how can we really know those things are absolute truths that we can base all other philosophy off of? Descartes laid the seeds of doubt in the West. His only absolute truth was that he knew he was thinking, therefore he knew he did exist. Everything else is up to questioning. Isaac Newton, who lived from 1642 to 1726, also greatly advanced the scientific revolution. He revolutionized our sense of the physical sciences and physics in general. He was the president of the British Royal Society from 1703 to 1727, and this was a society that was formed to apply modern scientific developments to the betterment of humanity. So they're a very Enlightenment society that's trying to basically help form the institutions of the West in alignment with the new academic thought that's developing in the 17th and then the 18th centuries. The Enlightenment philosophers would end up continuing this trend of radical doubt in received tradition, and their main goal would be to attempt to replace traditional philosophy and especially theology, which was based on divine revelation, the scriptures and traditions, with scientific empiricism. The Enlightenment philosophers wanted to place scientific empiricism and natural rationalism as the foundations for Western civilization, and they wanted to get rid of the influence of divine revelation. Scripture would be replaced by natural rationalism. The Enlightenment philosophers encouraged Western society to scorn all faith in passed-on tradition from Christendom and forge a new world order based on materialistic reason alone. Okay. What would a Catholic scientific revolution have looked like? What would it have looked like if the Royal Society existed and if the Enlightenment movement had developed inside of a society which was still thoroughly Catholic? What if the societies in which these philosophical movements developed, what if these philosophers still submitted their thought to the judgment of the Church and allowed divine revelation to guide them? Well, there is nothing in the scientific revolution itself which is opposed to Catholicism. Francis Bacon's scientific method is, in fact, very useful in conducting natural studies. Not so useful in discussing supernatural realities, like things that can't be observed using the five senses. But in terms of observing the natural world, the scientific method is, in fact, very useful. And throughout medieval Europe, a number of intellectual revolutions had taken place in Catholic educational institutions, which had in fact prepared the way for the scientific revolution of the 18th century. So there could have been a scientific revolution which was still faithful to, and you could have used the scientific method still in a Catholic society. If you want to know what such, scientific, if you want to know what scientists would have looked like if they had remained faithful to the teachings of the Church, we can actually look at the prominent Catholic scientists which have used Francis Bacon's scientific method while still being faithful to the teachings of the Church. We could look at Father Gregor Mendel, who revolutionized genetic studies, Father Nicolas Steno, who helped us understand anatomy and even geology better, Father George Lemaitre, who studied physics, astrophysics, Father Sister Mary Keller, who was a computer scientist, and Father Robert Spitzer, who today is helping us appreciate astrophysics to a greater extent. All these scientists performed the scientific method within the context of a vibrant and obedient and faithful Catholic faith. So it is possible that the scientific revolution could have taken place within a Catholic society. In fact, even way back in the period of the Renaissance, St. Albert the Great once chastised St. Thomas Aquinas for writing a theological treatise when he was asked to write an exposition on a natural phenomenon. So St. Albert the Great was in favor of using only natural reason when discussing natural phenomenon, not doing so in a way that contradicted divine revelation, but still, you can't just cheat and come up with a theological answer for a physical phenomenon. St. Albert the Great believed you should come up with a physical answer for a physical phenomenon. So natural science is a very useful and good school of thought, and could be in line with a vibrant Catholic faith. Now, the scientific revolution will lead to the technological revolution at the end of the 18th and throughout the 19th century. Scientific studies bequeathed the Western academic system with profound understandings of chemistry, physics, including entropy, and combustion and electricity and more. These theoretical understandings of these principles enabled inventors to create steam and coal-powered engines, highly potent weaponry, and explosives. The Industrial Revolutions would then use those technologies to create more products for sale. And these industrial revolutions were entirely dependent on the scientific and technological revolutions. So let's talk about major technological advances that took place as a result of the scientific and technological revolutions, which are all a part of the Enlightenment movement. And let's look at how these technologies would end up making World War I far deadlier than any war that had ever taken place before. World War I had the destructive capacity which it did due to the 20th century destructive capability of Western technology. The war claimed the lives of 20 million people, 16 million military lives, 4 million civilian lives, and it wounded 21 more million people. The use of heavy artillery and machine guns led to what some call the death of chivalry, or the death of the importance of individual valor on the battlefield. It became more about the weapons you held and mere numbers than it did about individual valor. That's not to say there were no heroes in World War I, of course, but there wasn't as much of an importance of the brave knight going out and simply being better at using his weapons, I guess. Contending armies quickly came to entrench themselves on opposing sides of battlefields with machine guns and artillery pointed at one another because they could not advance due to the power of the enemy's technology. Okay, so let's look at some of that military technology. And we're going to compare the technology of World War I with the military technology in the 7 Years' War, since the technology in the 7 Years' War predated the Enlightenment. So the typical rifle used in the 7 Years' War, also known as the French and Indian War in America, could release about 4 rounds a minute. In World War I, guns could release 600 rounds a minute. The best artillery could shoot a cannonball that was about the size of a cantaloupe, about 2,000 feet per second, and it could go about 1 mile. In World War I, as you can see here, the Paris gun could launch a cannon 5,500 feet per second and could fire a cannon 75 miles. In the 7 Years' War, the primary form of military technology was simply the horse. In World War I, we had, by the end of the war, tanks were being used in combat, airplanes were being used for reconnaissance as well as for dropping bombs, and trains were used to transport soldiers very quickly, which dramatically changed the nature of warfare. Submarines were used to launch torpedoes into enemy ships, and even zeppelins were used to bomb cities in World War I. Chemical warfare was a factor in World War I, which had no precedence in the 7 Years' War, launching gas and highly potent, like liquid droplets over enemy trenches. And we could talk a little bit about chemical warfare for a moment. We'll get back to chemical warfare a little bit later on. The earliest possible date for the use of chemical warfare in World War I was January 2nd, 1915, though some argue that this German officer who wrote this letter referring to a chemical attack meant to write 1916, but since it was only January 2nd, he accidentally wrote the previous year, like a lot of us do, in January. The first recorded use of tear gas besides this letter was on December 19th, 1915. So the Germans first used tear gas on Allied forces in their trenches, but then they continued to develop more potent forms of gas attacks. The Germans continued to use mustard gas on all fronts for the remaining year. Mustard gas is not exactly poisonous, but it kind of dramatically irritates the lungs and the eyes, and it can be potent if you inhale enough of it. Eventually, the Allies researched using mustard gas, and they developed their own mustard gas attacks to use on the Germans. Allies also used what's called phosgene chlorine chemical weapons the same year, and these were much more deadly, and they had no color. So mustard gas is yellow, but phosgene chlorine is really deadly and had no color. So it had a bit of a smell, but you couldn't see it. Oh, I think I meant to write just gas up here, so that's my mistake. The mustard gas was developed by the Germans in 1917, actually. So previously they had just been using tear gas and then phosgene chlorine. Mustard gas was a fine, misty liquid that would contaminate the soil of trenches, and it would cause blistering, eye irritation, vomiting, and it would destroy the mucus lining of the bronchial tubes if inhaled. Now, it's interesting that the use of these weapons contradicted decrees from the 1899 Hague Declaration concerning asphyxiation gases and the 1907 Hague Convention on Land Warfare. So, we're going to talk more about the Hague Convention in a moment. And how shocking it was that asphyxiating gases and poison liquids were used, chemical warfare was used, even though two different conventions between different, Western powers declared these to be illegal in warfare. We're going to talk about why all the Western nations were so comfortable contradicting two conventions that they had just held shortly before the war. Let's talk about the development of explosives. So in the early 19th century, the first military explosives were simply cannonball shells filled with gunpowder that had a timed fuse. They were not very effective. It was more effective just to use a ball of lead that would kind of bounce throughout the field of battle. By World War I, there were a variety of explosives that were being used. Hand grenades had been developed to be thrown into enemy trenches upon advances. Landmines were used to fill no man's land to stop enemy advances. Zeppelin bombs were first used in 1914 by the Germans to bomb the city of London from Zeppelins. This also, by the way, had been outlawed by the Hague Convention. Naval mines were another form of explosives. Submarine torpedoes were another form, and aeroplane bombs were first used in 1915. Also, in World War I, flamethrowers were used to clear out enemy trenches. Absolutely brutal, monstrous, and even demonic forms of warfare. Would a Catholic society have really avoided using these weapons if it possessed the technology to invent them? So one might argue that, well, if there was the capability to invent chemical warfare, flamethrowers, and these bombs that could be dropped on cities and boats, then a Catholic nation would have used them as well. And the reason I would disagree that a Catholic society would have employed all technological means necessary to cause as much bodily damage as possible to the enemies is because there was a code of chivalry which developed in Christendom throughout the Middle Ages. Yes, there was a lot of scandalous military conflicts between Christian nations throughout the medieval period, and we're not going to dismiss that. But with that said, in the midst of that warring society, the church helped Christian warriors develop a code of chivalry. You can pause and read Leon Gautier's 10 Commandments of Chivalry. This was written in the 19th century, if you'd like. But basically, in the medieval Christian society, warfare was not a simple anything-goes affair. Knights were held to a strict code of ethics, which restrained the vices of warfare and helped the warriors find a path to sainthood. Okay, so it was not permitted to just do whatever was necessary to defeat your enemies. That would be a barbaric approach to warfare. Christians have a higher sense of warfare, that it is a necessary evil at times, but even in the midst of a military conflict, there are still morally binding principles which the church could have helped Western society realize. In other words, it is reasonable to suggest that in a Christian society, the code of chivalry could have prevented the Christian warriors who may have had to, they may have had to have fought, let's say in 1914, but a code of chivalry or something similar to it could have prevented Christian warriors from scheming up the sort of brutal and frankly barbaric weapons which the 19th and early 20th century European civilization conceived of. It was only a civilization which was untethered from traditional Christian morality, which would conceive of creating such barbaric weapons as gas bombs and Zeppelin bombs to be dropped upon innocent civilians in a city. As I mentioned, the Hague Conventions of 1899 and 1907 were both Enlightenment-inspired attempts to use a parliamentary process to legislate moral laws for international warfare. So they were attempting to replace the church's code of chivalry with a sort of secular, parliamentary conceived code of morality and code of ethics for warfare. These conventions banned the use of aircraft to dispense with bombs, and they banned the use of poisonous substances or gases in land warfare. They also banned the use of dumb, soft-tip bullets, which would change shape inside of the body and create more and more harm inside of the body than a hard-tipped bullet would have. These conventions also mandated that hospital ships be protected and that they serve all injured servicemen regardless of what nation they were from. It's fascinating that each of these mandates of the Hague Conventions were absolutely ignored in World War I. So hospital ships were sunk regularly, soft-tip bullets were used, bombs were dropped from airplanes and zeppelins, poisonous substances were used in trench warfare. How is it possible that these European nations, which all participated in the Hague Convention, could so quickly just ignore everything that they said was a binding ethic? The reason they could so quickly ignore these ethics of warfare was that Western civilization, even though Western civilization theoretically believed in the parliamentary process due to, how it reflected a social contract theory of governance, the Hague Convention listed moral principles as coming from that sort of a democratic process, which means that the origin of the moral principles they came up with was their own subjective parliamentary process. In other words, the ultimate origins of right and wrong was the collective decisions of men, which is a very subjective thing. So later, if other men decide they don't want to be bound to those moral principles, they don't have to. A parliament cannot create binding moral law. Only God can, because if man is coming up with rules, man also has the authority to break those rules, and that's what happened here. The Hague Convention came up with all these reasonable rules about how to govern the ethics of warfare, but they were just as quickly abandoned by other men that decided they didn't want to follow them anymore, because ethics needs to originate from God for it to have a truly binding effect upon a civilization. Now, some militaries may have still broken the rules if, let's say, the church had come up with the moral ethics for international warfare in the early 19th or the early 20th century. Some nations may have still broken those rules, but they would have been excommunicated and they would have had to have lived in fear of eternal damnation. And this is a powerful deterrent for anyone that cares for their eternal destiny. All right. Next, let's talk about the industrial revolutions which emerged out of the scientific and technological revolutions. Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations in the 18th century, and this tremendously influenced the economy of all future Western nations in the 19th century. Smith revolutionized economic thought by moving away from the medieval theory of mercantilism, which held that the world contained a set amount of wealth in the form of natural resources, which had to be distributed amongst all nations and peoples. Smith posited, rather, that wealth could be created by taking resources and fashioning products which were deemed valuable to the free market. Previously, greed was seen as always bad, because if you, in a mercantilist economy, wanted more wealth for yourself, that means you were taking it from someone else. But Smith identified greed, or self-interest, as a motivating factor, which would lead entrepreneurs to invest their own labor and resources and ingenuity into the production of products, which would add value to the market and would thus generate wealth not only for themselves, but the entire economy in which they lived. And so Smith says greed is good. His theories lead to the economic revolution of capitalism, a system in which financial institutions or banks are actually encouraged to dispense huge loans to those capable of forming factories to mass produce products. Previously, giving loans at interest was considered morally wrong, but because of Smith's economic revolution, giving loans so that people can start factories and purchase the capital needed to make more products, that's considered good, because those loans will ultimately help the entire economy grow. Factories generated lots of products and lots of wealth. Granted, they could generate that wealth if markets were available to purchase the products made in those factories. And another thing that industrialization was dependent upon was that the nations industrializing were capable of producing enough crops to support an urbanizing population. The capitalist revolution, coupled with the technological revolution, produced machinery which was increasingly capable of producing greater quantities and greater qualities of products. However, there was a series of economic panics or depressions in the 1840s, which were similar or even greater perhaps than the depressions of the 1930s. Throughout Europe and the United States, droughts and crop failures plagued newly industrializing economies, probably as a result of less farmers being able to yield crops for their entire nation. More people are moving into cities to work in factories. Now there's less farmers in rural areas, but they need to grow even more crops than they personally did before to provide enough food for themselves and everyone living in urban areas. And perhaps they weren't ready for this challenge yet. In fact, most of the time when you see a country industrializing, you're going to have some dramatic famine that kills many people from hunger because it's a big shift to be able to produce that much crops all at once. You saw that in the industrialization in the Soviet Union and in China as well, except those were far worse because their governments were incompetent. So as crop failure dramatically rose the price of living throughout the Western nations, inflation soared throughout the West. Because the price of wheat is the base of all the economies of the 19th century. And so if that price goes up, everything else is going to go up too because everybody else has to purchase that wheat. They need enough money to purchase it. So inflation roars throughout the West in the 1840s. This inflation was exasperated by poor government monetary policies and a lack of regulation of paper currencies. Overprinting led to even more inflation. As the price of living caused consumption throughout the West to decrease, so because everything is more expensive, people can't purchase as much. Now factories aren't selling as many products, and now there's going to be mass layoffs. So there's these mass layoffs throughout the 1840s. The inability to pay back loans, so these factories couldn't pay back the loans that had helped them open their doors in the first place. A large number of financial institutions began to collapse, and now you have less loans in general. You have less economic growth because no one can get loans to start new factories. The unrest caused by these economic panics caused mass revolts throughout Europe in the 1840s, and this was the context in which the Communist Manifesto was written as well as a silly and ridiculous solution to the economic crises of the 1840s. The need to expand their markets beyond the West contributed to the new imperialism. In order to find new customers for their products, European nations began to look overseas to establish more overseas colonies so that they could have more customers for their products and also so they could have more sources of crops and resources in general. Eventually the Western civilization would recover from the panics of the 1840s, and they would continue to industrialize more and more. And it was the factories which spread throughout Europe in the rest of the 19th century which would allow the European nations to mass produce the destructive forces which, as we said before, contributed to the devastation of World War I. Now, guys, ultimately the Industrial Revolution was a good thing. The global economy before industrialization could only support about 750 million people. After industrialization, as we know, the global economy today can support about 8 billion people. So we're not going to say industrialization itself is bad, but we are going to ask, what would the Industrial Revolution have looked like in a Christian society under a Christian Western ethos? How would the Industrial Revolution have looked differently if it had occurred in a Christian society? To start off with, greed would not have been recognized as a sort of economic virtue, even if entrepreneurship would have been. And what I mean by that is, okay, you would value entrepreneurship, but the theoretical reason that it would be valued for certain people to start new factories was so that they could better society, and so that if they do gain more and more wealth, they can use that wealth to serve God and spread his kingdom. Because the church has always understood that while private property is good, we should not recognize our property as really belonging to us, but belonging to God. And all of our property and wealth should be used for whatever purposes God might want. The church would have probably entered into a similar relationship with industrial lords as they had previously with feudal lords. And it's also very popular that dioceses like bishops and monasteries may well have invested in manufacturing endeavors if they still possess the same power that they had throughout the medieval period. So when medieval Europe became a feudal society, many monasteries and bishops began to take part in that economic system to generate wealth to use for God's kingdom. And so they began to run feudal estates, feudal farms. It's possible that if the West had remained a Catholic society, then monasteries and bishops would have opened factories as well. In these factories, certainly, but in all factories in a Christian society, the dignity of the worker would not have been trampled upon, as they had been in Adam Smith's economic revolution, where greed is considered the highest good of the economy. Well, in that system, you're going to have the owners of factories taking advantage of their workers as much as possible, forcing them to work ungodly hours and giving them very little pay. There would have been a sense of the dignity of the worker. And they would have had more respect, and they would have had better pay and better living conditions in a Catholic society. Similar to the conditions that we see Pope Leo XIII argue all workers are owed in his encyclical Rerum Novarum. As mentioned previously, principles of chivalry would have prevented these industrial factories from producing, frankly, ungodly weapons such as chemical bombs and bombs to be used upon civilians in general. So factories would not have been used, they wouldn't have been willing to have been used for the evil purposes for which they were used in World War I. Church-owned factories, monastery-owned factories, and God-fearing industrialists would have refused to comply with creating weapons which the church would have condemned if the West had remained a Christian society. Next, let's talk about hyper-nationalism. So, to begin with, let's review the key principles of the Christian state as we talked about in the very first video of this series. The first point of a Christian state, which undergirds what the purpose of that state is that the interests and the service of God are more important than the interests or the service of the state. National calamities and national prosperity are both understood as interventions of God. Calamities are likely the result of vice in the citizens or the leaders, and prosperity is likely the reward for the virtue and sanctity of the citizens and leaders. Finally, while the church and the state are distinct, a Christian society recognizes that the state should seek to manifest the ordering and the happiness of the city of God by ordering each of its institutions within the divine order and accepting the role of the church in helping the state to do this. So the church has primacy over the state because the church is able to guide the state to order each element of the state towards the glory of God. Okay, now with that said, did Christendom live up to the ideals we just talked about? Not exactly, and arguably no society ever perfectly lives up to its ideals, but living up to the Christian ideals that we just talked about are especially challenging because a Christian society has to constantly battle against the fallen state of man, both in the government and in the citizenry, in order to live up to its ideals. A Christian society has the highest ideals of any society, and so they are, of course, the most difficult to live up to, especially because we are all fallen creatures. It's not as easy to choose good as it is to choose bad. However, even though no Christian society lived up to its ideals, even in the fallen state, where Christian monarchs might be serving themselves rather than God, if these Christian monarchs lived in a Christian society, they would know that in order to best serve themselves, they needed to pretend they were serving God, which in and of itself has some merit, even if they are pretending and being hypocritical. At least they are pretending, which means they are going to do some good for their society in the direction of a divine order. Christian monarchs would receive honor for establishing monasteries and shrines and for funding crusades to defend Christendom from Muslim annihilation. Even this facade of piety entailed some level of submission to the spiritual authority of the church and the papacy, which would keep even immoral and self-centered Christian monarchs within some boundaries of the divine order. Now, in an Enlightenment state, we are going to see secular states which champion the separation of society from Christian ideals. Formerly, Christian society saw the glory and service of God as the highest end of the state and of the society's many institutions. What would be the highest goal or end of a secular state? The service of itself, the service of the nation or the people, collectively known as the nation. And the nation is what gave legitimacy to the state because of the social contract theory. So if it's the nation which gives legitimacy to the state's purpose is to serve the nation or serve the people rather than serve God. In an Enlightenment secular state, the state is seen as existing for the purpose of defending, promoting, serving, and glorifying the nation. Over time, the vacuum created in a secular state by a lack of orientation towards God leads the state to enthrone the nation itself as the divinity which is served by the nation. The glory of the nation would become the motivating factor guiding Western powers throughout the rest of the 19th and early 20th centuries. Let's talk for a moment now, let's break down, just to summarize what we just talked about, the ideals and kind of the adversaries or the enemies of Christian societies and secular societies. Okay, so in a Christian society, the main goal is to promote the church's mission by providing the financial means and the freedom for religious orders, churches, and monasteries to do the work of God. And the other goal is to establish a peaceful, well-ordered society in which people can reasonably and easily serve God. The enemies of a Christian state are moral disorder, the lack of Christian education, heresies, financial struggles to the church's mission, and in medieval times, Muslim jihadists and pagan hordes who wanted to attack the Christian state and upend its holy institutions. Notice how these goals and adversaries are different than the goals and adversaries of a secular state. The goal of a secular state, when it comes down to it, is worldly economic prosperity and that the nation is glorified as the world's greatest. If the nation becomes the end or the purpose of the state, then the state wants to, theoretically, make the nation the greatest nation on the earth. That is the goal. So the nation being glorified as the world's greatest, or adored, is sort of like one of the goals of a secular state. The enemies of the secular state would be other nations which present themselves as rival world powers in the global economy, and internal factors such as crime, illiteracy, or even ideologies which contradict the national agenda. Let's look at some evidence of hyper-nationalism in the 19th centuries. There is a famous song which was sung throughout pubs in 19th century Britain called Rule Britannia by Thomas Arl. I'll read a couple stanzas from this song. It goes, "When Britain first at heaven's command arose from out of the azure main, arose from out of the azure main. This was the charter of the land, and guardian angels sang this strain, Rule Britannia, Britannia rule the waves, Britons never, never, never will be slaves." So we see here this idea that the empire, the ruling of all the seas by Britain, is perceived as originating in heaven itself. He continues, "Still more majestic shalt thou rise, more dreadful from each foreign stroke, more dreadful, dreadful from each foreign stroke, as the loud blast that tears the skies serves but to root thy native oak. Rule Britannia, Britannia rule the waves, Britons never, never, never will be slaves. Thee haughty tyrants ne'er shall tame, all their attempts to bend thee down. All their attempts to bend thee down will but arouse thy generous flame, but work their woe and thy renown. Rule Britannia, Britannia rule the waves." Let's look at some evidence of this hyper-nationalism in Germany from the 19th centuries. We'll begin by reading this quote from Modris Eckstein, a historian of the First World War. He says that Germanness was, by necessity, a matter of spiritual association rather than geographical or even racial delineation. Germanness is seen as a spiritual reality rather than a geographical or racial one. These are, firstly, these are all quotes from Wilhelm II, the German Kaiser, during the First World War. "Despite not having the fleet we should have, we have conquered for ourselves a place in the sun. It is now my task to see to it that this place in the sun shall remain our undisputed possession." He also said, "There will be a racial war, a war of Slavdom against Germandom, with the Anglo-Saxons with whom we are related by common ancestry, religion, and civilization building. The racial struggle cannot be avoided. It may not take place now, but it will probably take place in 1 or 2 years. So he sees an inevitable clash between nations. He thinks that the different nationalities are destined to battle it out to see which will rise as the glorious, triumphant race of the Western people. He talks here about how he believes that his duty to defend the people and the nation has been given him by God itself. And then he said, whoever tries to interfere with my task to increase this heritage, I shall crush. He also talks very negatively of other nationalities as well. We can also read a quote from Johann Herder, who said, Johannes Herder, a German philosopher, every nation has its center of happiness within itself, as every ball has its center of gravity. So the center of happiness of a nation is in its own self. The nation is the source of happiness for the nation. This is pointing to a sort of self-deification of the nation. God is the source of happiness of every nation, not the nation itself. Okay? So, to be clear, patriotism, or pride in one's country, and nationalism, pride in one's nationality, are in and of themselves good. And a Christian society would have kept this in perspective by both celebrating one's country and one's nation, but also remembering that our true citizenship is in heaven, and our truest society on earth is the church. We are first and foremost Catholics, and we are second our nationalities. The very notion of Christendom refers to the idea that all of the states of the Western society are in reality unified under the spiritual authority of Christ and his vicar, the Pope. We are all, in fact, one society as Catholics, and our particular nationalities are a bit inconsequential when compared to our identity as Catholics. All Catholic societies recognize the profound spiritual communion they held with one another in Christ, even while also recognizing and celebrating the distinctions of nationality. Social Darwinism, the sense that all the different peoples of the world are competing for survival, gave Westerners, as well as their loss of sense of communion in the Catholic Church. So both social Darwinism and the loss of a sense of communion in the church led many Westerners to overemphasize race or nationality as the key categorization scheme for understanding all human distinctions and human geopolitics in general. When the church discusses race and nationality, we do so within the context of understanding that we are all in fact one family, not only in the Catholic Church, but also we're all one family as descendants of Adam and Eve, regardless of membership within the society of humanity that God calls us to in the church. Wars, then, are seen as regrettable necessities when grave causes arise. They are not metaphysical clashes between opposing races or spiritual volks. Hypernationalism plunges nationalities into warfare because hypernationalism perceives warfare as the fullest expression of the glory of the nation. The church would have never had this mistaken sense that war was a glorious expression of the valor of the nation. We as Catholics recognize war is a sometimes necessary tragedy. Nationalism and industrialization was dependent on the technological revolution, which was dependent on the scientific revolution. All these things are going to lead to the new imperialism. Europe spreading out and establishing colonies all throughout the world. That's the next chapter here. And before we talk about the new imperialism and how European colonies led to the First World War, we're going to have to first talk about 19th century geopolitics in general. And when we talk about 19th century geopolitics, we usually refer to it as the long 19th century, which I'm going to talk about as being between 1789 and 1913. And we're going to talk about how the Enlightenment led to the French Revolution, which led to Napoleon, and that led to the fall of Napoleon. And we have a lot more to talk about. We're going to do all this in a part 2 of this video. So let's conclude now with a prayer before we finish this talk on how the Enlightenment caused World War I. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spirituis Sancti. Pater noster, qui es in celi, sanctificetur nomen tuum, adveniat regnum tuum. Fiat voluntas tua sicut in cielo et in terra. panem nostrum quotidianum de nobis hodie, et dimite nobis debita nostra, sicut et nos dimitimis debitoribus nostris, et ne nos inducas in tentationem, sed libera nos a malo. Amen. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spirituis Sancti. Well, God bless you. May the Holy Spirit of truth remove from your minds anything I've said unpleasing to him or untrue. See you next time in part 2 of how the Enlightenment caused World War I.